Thanks for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces. Well, this is kind of an elevated dress rehearsal. You realize this is a world premiere, that we put a new script and a new show together in a month. I came here from Seattle on January 16th, and this is February 17th. Usually for a new script, it takes me 7, 8, or 9 months. You know, it's like childbirth. But this group of people, they're a bunch of troopers and very hardworking, and they know the material because many of them have lived it. So I just welcome you, and I know that you'll be kind, right? I also do want your honest to goodness comments, though. There are some handouts on this education table, as well as Cynthia's new book that's just out, and Victor Yamada's project, Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, that you might be familiar with. That will be our next project for the next grant round that's coming up in October. This one is called Nisei, the Greatest Generation. You might recognize that term from Tom Brokaw. And so we wanted to highlight the greatest generations of Japanese Americans who were born during the 20s or slightly before the 20s, grew up during the Depression years, matured during World War II. So the subtitle of this program is Soldiers, Protesters, and Prisoners. And there's a lot of New Mexico in it. I've been told to ask you to turn off your cell phones. Mine is in my purse and it's not off yet, but I'll turn it off, Mary. I just wanted to say that this is a special event that Eileen O'Connell has arranged for us, that many of you come to the second Saturday at 10 a.m. for the speaker series. Well, that series is so popular that it was filled by the time we got this show together. So she made a special arrangement for us to be here on this Saturday. So I'm very glad to see all of you. Last year, our first performance was at the Maxwell Museum, and that was on August 12th, 2017. And Dave Phillips, the director of the museum, in his introduction said that he had just heard that there was a tragedy in Charlottesville, Virginia, where a peaceable gathering was interrupted by somebody driving their car into the crowd, and that woman had been killed. And so he said that this is a reminder that intolerance is not something from long ago and far away. And he thanked us for bringing this program from last year called Infamy, from Days of Infamy to Days of Remembrance, to Maxwell Museum, and then we subsequently toured New Mexico. And so I thank you today for coming to remind us about solidarity, about kindness, about compassion, and maybe a little bit of righteous indignation, because that's what moves us toward action. So please enjoy this show. We still have a lot of things to work out. I would like to have your comment. On the handout is my email, because we're still fine-tuning it. Thanks a lot.
Ichi. Ni. San.
A 1, a 2, a 3.
Nisei,
First generation. Nisei.
second generation,
Sansei.
third,
The first generation of Japanese in America is called
Nisei.
The second generation of Japanese in America is called
Nisei.
They are the daughters and sons of Japanese who immigrated to America over 100 years ago. They are the greatest generation.
We were born just before or during the 20s.
Survived the Great Depression.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
And we're ready for life in the 40s.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor.
What is Pearl Harbor?
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 7th, 1941, the first bomb that fell over Honolulu crashed into the yard of Thomas Fujimoto, a Japanese American.
I wasn't real scared or anything. After all, Japan was way over there and America's way over here, and gee whiz, we're American citizens.
When the war broke out, I was a 20-year-old trucker working for my father, an Nisei potato farmer in Nebraska. I knew I couldn't continue trucking during the war, and I asked my father what to do. Without batting an eye, he said,
"Enlist in the Army, Ben. America is your country."
my brother Fred and I got in the car and drove to the nearest recruiting station to volunteer. When we got there, the recruiter said, "We don't want Japs."
The young Nisei trucker from Nebraska who overcame his government's discriminatory policies to become the only Japanese American pilot to fly over Japan died in September 2015 at the age of 98. After Ben and his brother Fred were refused induction in 1942 because of their race, they drove 150 miles to another recruiter who allowed them to sign up.
The Air Force was banning flyers of Japanese ancestry, but Ben earned his way onto a bomber crew and flew 58 missions over Europe, North Africa, and Japan during the war.
He took part in the August 1943 raid over Nazi oil fields in Palestine, Romania.
310 flyers in my group were killed.
He was captured when his plane ran out of fuel in Morocco, but
My crewmates and I were able to escape to England.
He was refused permission to fly a B-29 bomber over the Pacific, but after repeated and persistent requests,
And a review of his service record, Secretary of War Stimson made an exception.
crew members named him Most Honorable Son, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. In 1944, in a Time magazine tribute, Heroes, he was listed as
Ben Kuroki, American.
Calling your Asian crew member honorable son might seem to be buying into stereotypes. But I hear a lot of respect and admiration and, affectionate humor in that nickname. Ben was always talking about his crew. They flew all those missions together, escaped together after capture in Morocco. Those boys went through a lot together.
He was an honorable son. He did what his dad told him to do.
Enlist in the Army, Ben. America is your country.
It wasn't his dad's country. It was the country of his children. And that's what the father told him to do.
He was an honorable son to his folks living in an internment camp back home. An honorable brother-in-arms to his crew.
In 2005, at the age of 88, he was awarded the U.S. Army's Distinguished Service Medal, one of this country's highest military honors.
I had to fight like hell for the right to fight for my country. I now feel vindicated.
Terry Toyomi Nakanishi, Women's Army Corps Military Intelligence Service.
I was a tomboy. My older sister always scolded.
Why can't you be more ladylike?
I spent my early childhood in Montana, where my immigrant stepfather worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. I was raised in a strict bilingual household. The American way was always emphasized. I didn't like going to Japanese language school after regular school. I liked playing outdoors. Baseball and marbles, ice skating and sledding.
I wish you would be more ladylike.
After December 7th, 1941, my world fell apart. My stepfather lost his job and our family was thrown out of our rented house. We had to live in our car. We were taken in by friends in Idaho and worked in the potato fields to pay our rent. My brother Kiyoshi volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Another brother joined the 442nd. A third brother joined the Military Intelligence Service. I wanted to serve too, but my mother Yano said it wasn't ladylike to join the military. My brother Kiyoshi said,
You take care of the home front and we'll do the fighting.
One day I saw a recruitment flyer and went to volunteer. I was turned down because of my ethnicity, but finally the wax opened up to Nisei.
Only 80 Nisei women were part of the Women's Army Corps. Because there were so few, the government integrated them into mainstream military units. This wasn't the case for Puerto Rican, African American, or Japanese American men.
In 1945, I was one of the first Nisei WACs to be recruited into the Military Intelligence Service. I was assigned to march the women every morning. Many of them were 5 feet tall or under. Boy, was it difficult to keep them synchronized.
Approximately 50 Nisei women served in the MIS language school during World War II. They were trained in speaking and writing military-style Japanese.
I wanted to be assigned to medical service, but was sent to the clerical pool.
But you have such superior typing skills.
But we were co-ed at Fort Snelling, so there was dating. In November 1945, I met a Honolulu soldier with the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, Toshio Lefty Nakanishi. 2 months later, we were married at Fort Snelling. We were often apart because Lefty was involved in many covert and undercover missions. Then after the war, we were both assigned to occupy Japan.
Because General MacArthur did not approve of women in the military, the WACs were disbanded in Japan and offered civil service jobs within the Army.
Post-war Japan was in shambles. People were starving, orphans were begging on the street.
Terry was assigned to G2 Intelligence Services under General MacArthur, giving administrative support and translation services for the trials of war criminals.
Later, we returned to the United States and raised a family. I wasn't able to fulfill my dream of becoming a nurse, but I devoted a lot of time to volunteering for the Red Cross.
by pursuing the non-traditional path of military service for women of her time. Terry Nakanishi and her Nisei comrades challenged the stereotypes of Japanese American women.
Here we are all those years ago, my mother Yano and Kiyoshi and I in uniform. My mother had changed her mind about my being in military service.
Kiyoshi was killed in action in 1945. Terry Nakanishi died last year at the age of 96.
During World War II, all Americans of Japanese descent living on the West Coast were removed from their homes and put into prison camps. Executive Order number 9066 deprived them of their rights, although they never had been accused of any crime. 120,000 Japanese Americans.
On February the 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast. On December 8th, the financial resources of the Nisei community were frozen, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation seized community leaders, Buddhist priests, Christian ministers, Japanese language teachers, owners of commercial fishing boats, all those thought to be security risks.
On the night Papa heard about Pearl Harbor, he burned the Japanese flag he had brought with him from Hiroshima 35 years ago. It was such a beautiful piece of material. I couldn't believe he was doing it. He burned papers and documents, anything that might connect him to Japan. But those precautions did not help him, because he was not only an alien, because after 35 years he still was not allowed to become an American citizen, but he held a commercial fishing license. The FBI were picking up such men for fear they were making contact with enemy ships off the coast of California. They took Papa to Fort Lincoln, an alien internment camp in Bismarck, North Dakota, where he was interrogated. Jeannie Wakatsuki Houston, from her memoir, Farewell to Manzanar.
The young men who had come to America at the turn of the century were now in a deadly conundrum. They had lived here for decades. They had American-born children, and yet Asian exclusion laws had prevented them from citizenship, and now they were enemy aliens.
On December 7, 1941, the FBI entered my family's home in Seattle, interrupting my 4th birthday party. The big man in the brown hat put bracelets on my father and said he has to go with them. My mother called out my father's name, Shoichi, Shoichi, so softly I could hardly hear. The FBI man with the orange hair told my mother, "Cute baby." "I'm 4, I said. Later, when my mother and I and our friends and neighbors in Seattle were in Minidoka, Idaho, I would sit on the steps of my barrack opening gift boxes from my father's canteen in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were stamped enemy alien mail, but inside there would be lifesavers, Tootsie Rolls, chewing gum, and Pueblo pottery on a beaded bracelet, and one time a little wooden Kachina doll. Shirley Sadayo Nojima, Seattle, Washington.
Approximately 2,500 Nisei were arrested and detained by the FBI immediately after December 7, 1941.
Many of the families never knew where their fathers were taken. Letters were forbidden. After a couple of months, it was okay to send letters, but they were censored. Why? For security reasons?
Soon after the arrest, Nisei from all around Southern California were loaded onto the passenger train at the Los Angeles Railroad Station. Approximately 50 prisoners on 20 cars. There were 2 soldiers at the front and rear with a rifle and bayonet. Why? For security reasons.
The blinds were down, so we couldn't look outside to see where we were going. Since I knew my geography, I peeked every once in a while to let everyone know where we were. First stop, Fresno, Stockton, Sacramento, Redding. We are now in Oregon, Eugene, Portland. Next stop, Washington, Tacoma, Seattle. At every stop, we picked up more Nisei, about 850 altogether. Then it was through Idaho and Montana. Our destination, Fort Lincoln, Bismarck, North Dakota.
North Dakota? We were from Southern California. We felt like we were stepping into a refrigerator plant. They said it was 5 degrees Fahrenheit. We were freezing.
The Nisei and Sansei don't know what their fathers and grandfathers went through because they never talked about Fort Lincoln. It was about 10 acres of no man's land, surrounded by 8-foot fence with 6 guard towers. A white fence went right through the center of the compound, half for the German POWs and the other half for Niseis. Altogether about 1,400 internees. Morning and night, soldiers came with rifles for a head count. They became quite friendly and talkative.
The food wasn't so good, no taste. So we all got together and complained to the officials. Complaining did the trick.
Since we didn't know how to play soccer like the Germans, we challenged them to baseball. But we always lost because the German team had players 18 to 30 years old. They had youth on their side.
The Constitution says that there must be a jury trial for each and every one. It started in July 1942 with 5 lawyers and 3 Korean interpreters. The Koreans were very good in Japanese, but awful in English. Actually, I understood the broken English about 25% of the time. When my jury trial came up, I told the lawyer to just get rid of the interpreters. They didn't know I spoke English, and they were surprised. During the trial, they asked me all kinds of stupid questions. I don't want to go into detail, but I talked myself out of Fort Lincoln. The final decision was, get the hell out of here. You don't belong here. Then I was sent to Santa Anita Assembly Center.
Santa Anita Assembly Center housed 19,000 people for 215 days on the site of the famous racetrack. Hastily constructed barracks lined the parking lot, and the horses were removed from the stables for human habitation. But the smell of manure lingered. Searchlights scanned the center at night, and barbed wire encircled the entire area. In October 1942, the Santa Anita internees were transferred to permanent camps in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Utah, and Arkansas.
Other temporary camps were set up in whatever large spaces could accommodate several thousand people.
We were at the Washington State Fairgrounds from spring to September 1942, living under the grandstand, in horse stalls, or in hastily built barracks on the grounds. The wood for those new barracks were so green that it shrunk as it baked in the summer sun, making gaps so large spiders, snakes, and all kinds of creepy crawlers were our roommates.
Yep, and that camp was called Camp Harmony.
On May 6, 1942, Portland, Oregon was declared the first city on the West Coast to be
Free of all people of Japanese ancestry.
We left our homes, jobs, possessions, and the lives we had built. We were subject to registration, curfews, and imprisonment.
Over 3,700 people were assembled at the Pacific International Livestock Exposition Center.
May 2nd, 1942. 364 Portlanders report to the Assembly Center. May 4th, 722 persons report.
People drove by in cars, gawking at us.
We lived in animal stalls that still stank of livestock.
May 5th, 618 report. May 6th, total population of the Assembly Center, 1,707. May 7th, a son is born to Mr. and Mrs. Yoshio Mehara.
Way to go.
Population 1,708. Population reaches 2,554 on May the 20th. Increases to 2,849, May 23rd. June 5th, 520 arrived from Yakima Valley, Washington. 628 more on June 6th. Official population now 3,780.
September 1942, the first group of Oregonians leave for Minidoka, Idaho.
The order came in 42 from the president, and they told us to take only what you can carry, labeled with our name tag stamps. They shipped us to internment camps, like cattle herded in stalls. The rooms had barely any walls. Up and down the western states, they took our land and sealed our fates. Our homes and orchards left behind, like the Constitution, oh but never mind. Swept away like a dusty breeze, no crime or trial if you're Japanese. Surrounded by barbed wire fence for 2+ years, and ever since they say, take only what you can carry. The order came in 42 from the president, and they told us to take only what you can carry. Take only what you can carry. Take only what you can carry.
The War Relocation Authority, WRA, was a government agency established to handle the forced relocation of Japanese Americans during World War II. WRA camps were located in desolate areas, far from population centers, surrounded by barbed wire, with towers whose guns pointed in.
Manzanar, California.
Topaz, Utah.
Heart Mountain, Wyoming.
Gila River, Arizona.
Minidoka, Idaho.
Houston, Arizona.
Rover, Arkansas.
Jerome, Arkansas.
Tule Lake, California.
Grenada, Colorado.
At a population of 7,318, Grenada was the smallest of the 10 camps. Colorado's Republican governor, Ralph Lawrence Carr, took a unique position against the popular sentiment of the day. Alone among Western governors, he spoke out about the internment of Japanese Americans.
An American citizen of Japanese descent has the same rights as any other citizen. If you harm them, you must first harm me. I was brought up in small towns where I knew the shame and the dishonor of race hatred. I grew to despise it because it threatened the happiness of you, and you, and you.
Carr's advocacy of racial tolerance and protection of the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans cost him his political career. In 1942, 3 young men tested the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066 and its curfew, mass removal, and incarceration. Gordon Hirabayashi, Fred Korematsu, Minoru Min Yasui.
Gordon Hirabayashi was a Nisei from a farming community outside of Seattle, Washington. His father immigrated from Japan in 1907, his mother in 1914. Gordon was born in 1915. He was a sociology student at the University of Washington and a member of the American Friends, the Quakers.
In 1942, following my pacifist belief, I intentionally broke the curfew of the order to challenge the Constitution of Executive Order 9066. After I was arrested, I was sentenced to Tucson Federal Prison in Arizona. The government informed me that they could not afford the transportation, and so I offered to get there on my own.
As I went walking that ripping up highway,
I hitchhiked over the next several weeks
that endless skyway.
from Spokane, Washington, through Weiser, Idaho, then to Salt Lake City, and down to Tucson. When I arrived, the warden said,
"We got no papers on you."
they considered just letting me go back home.
But, well, that might look suspicious. How about going into town while we wire for your papers? Taking a movie, grab some dinner.
By the time I returned, they had my papers, and I began to serve my 9-month term. I became acquainted with a number of other wartime federal prisoners, drafted resistors, Jehovah's Witnesses, conscientious objectors, along with more ordinary type nonviolent federal offenders, immigration violators, bootleggers, bank robbers. My time in Tucson prison was very inspiring. It recommitted me to my pacifist beliefs to upholding the Constitution in all my actions. Later, I served a year in McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State.
What for?
For refusing induction into the armed service. I felt the questionnaire.
Questionnaire?
Question number 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question number 28. Will you forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization?
Asking me if I would give up loyalty to the emperor of Japan was racially discriminating. How could I give up loyalty that I never had?
After the war, Gordon earned his BA, MA, and PhD in sociology and taught in Beirut, Lebanon, and Cairo, Egypt. In 1959, he joined the faculty of the University of Alberta and served as their chair of sociology from 1970 to 1975.
Shortly after his retirement in 1983, he was invited by a team of civil rights lawyers to reopen his wartime conviction on the basis of government misconduct. In 1987, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of his case.
In 1999,
I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me.
in 1999, the Coronado National Forest renamed the site where the Tucson prison once stood in honor of Gordon Hirabayashi. In 2002, the forest unveiled an interpretive kiosk at the site telling the Hirabayashi story, as well as stories of 14 Nisei draft resistors who also served time in the prison.
There was a time when I felt the Constitution had failed me, but the U.S. government had admitted it made a mistake. A country that can do that is a strong country. And you know, our case is not a Japanese case, it is an American case.
Gordon Hirabayashi died on January 2nd, 2012. In May of that year, President Barack Obama awarded him a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom.
I was born in Oakland, California in 1919, the third of 4 sons. My parents lived in the U.S. since 1905, but were unable to become citizens because of Asian exclusion laws. I encountered institutional racism firsthand when an Army recruiting officer came to our high school and handed out recruiting flyers, but not to me. He said,
"We got orders not to accept you."
And this was before we were at the war with Japan. But even then, my girlfriend Ida Boitano's Italian parents thought Japanese were inferior to white people and unfit to mix with them. I trained as a welder in the shipyard so I could contribute to the defense effort. One day I went to work and my time card was gone. My coworkers explained that I couldn't work there anymore because I was Japanese. So I found another job, but was fired after my supervisor came back from vacation and learned of my race.
On May 3rd, 1942, General DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense, ordered
all people of Japanese ancestry to report to assembly centers in preparation for removal to permanent camps.
My very life is in her keeping. I'm just a prisoner of law.
I ignored the order and went into hiding because I wanted to stay with my Caucasian fiancée. I even resorted to plastic surgery on my eyes to look less Asian. But I was arrested and sent to jail in San Francisco. Shortly after, the ACLU asked me to be a test case. I was tried and convicted in federal court and given 5 years probation. And then I was sent to Topaz Camp in Utah. Some disdained me for disobeying the government. I felt isolated in camp. When people recognized me, they were afraid of being seen of talking to a troublemaker. It was worse than jail. My appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals failed, and in December 1944, I lost my case before the Supreme Court.
But in the 1980s, it was discovered that the Solicitor General of the United States had deliberately suppressed reports from the FBI and military intelligence.
That these reports concluded that Japanese Americans posed no security risks.
That the military had lied to the Supreme Court and government lawyers had made false arguments.
When his conviction was vacated on November 10, 1983, Korematsu said,
Anyone should do any of the pardoning, it should be me pardoning the government.
And he spoke out after 9/11 on how the U.S. government should not let the same thing happen to people of Mid-Eastern descent. When prisoners were detained at Guantanamo Bay, he filed 2 briefs with the Supreme Court, warning them not to make the same mistakes, meaning the Japanese-American internments.
Still, I say protest, but not with violence. And don't be afraid to speak up. One person can make a difference, even if it's after 40 years.
Min Yasui was the first to test the constitutionality of the curfews imposed on Japanese after the declaration of war. Born in Hood River, Oregon in 1942, he was 25 years old, the first Japanese-American lawyer in Oregon, an active member of the Japanese-American Citizens League, and an Army Reserve officer. He was also a fervent believer in the law. It is March 28, 1942, 11 o'clock at night, a police station in Portland, Oregon. A policeman sits at a desk.
I'm
Sir, are you aware of General DeWitt's Proclamation Number 3 pursuant to Public Law 503? General DeWitt has proclaimed a curfew effective tonight, March 28, 1942. No person of Japanese ancestry is to leave their place of residence between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Sir, I am a person of Japanese ancestry. Here is my birth certificate. It is now 11:05, 3 hours and 5 minutes past the curfew hour. I am in violation of the law. The curfew proclaimed by General DeWitt, head of the Western Defense Command.
What are you getting at, son?
Sir, you must arrest me.
Arrest you? Hey, go on home now. You're going to get in trouble.
Sir, I insist. I have been walking these streets since 8 p.m. and my feet are tired. My secretary has been calling you periodically to advise you of my violation of the curfew, but you didn't send out any officers.
Listen, son, we got better things to do.
Sir, you must arrest me. I have violated an order proclaimed by General DeWitt, who is your commanding officer, as he is the head of the Western Defense...
I know who General DeWitt is.
It is your duty as an officer of the law to arrest me, sir.
Oh, all right. You asked for it. You're under arrest. Guard!
Min spends 9 months in solitary confinement. His appeal to the Supreme Court fails, and he spends the rest of the war years in Minidoka, Idaho. After the war, he moves to Denver, Colorado, where he becomes active in civil rights causes for other minorities.
I was incarcerated in Topaz, Utah until the age of 5. My generation and I suffered under embarrassment at looking like the enemy. So we completely denied our ethnic background. I stopped speaking Japanese or wearing kimonos. But now I consider Min Yasui to be the Martin Luther King Jr. of the Japanese American movement. I first met him in 1983. He came frequently to Utah to advise and encourage us. Because of him and other heroes of our movement, I have been speaking to schools, colleges, and organizations. Now, at the end of my presentations, I celebrate being Japanese American by performing the taiko. And I always dedicate my presentations to my parents. Alice Hirai, Ogden, Utah Chapter, JCL.
Min Yasui worked tirelessly for redress in the 70s and 80s. He came frequently to New Mexico, as well as to other mountain states, to advocate for redress.
In 1984, Pete Domenici was invited to be the keynote speaker at a JCL conference in Albuquerque.
Much to the dismay of our local JCL chapter, because Senator Pete Domenici was a staunch opponent of redress.
Yeah, wasn't he invited by mistake when the original keynote speaker got bowed out because he was sick?
I remember we were really worried because Min was scheduled to give a talk on redress just before the keynote. He was, as everyone knows, an eloquent and passionate speaker.
So was Pete Domenici, a powerful member of the Republican Party.
Well, Min spoke first on the program and was his usual articulate and enthusiastic self.
Then Pete Domenici gets up, heads to the podium, slowly takes out his notes and makes a gesture and lays them on the lectern and says,
Min Yasui is a truly eloquent and powerful speaker who I will not attempt to follow this evening. But Min Yasui is a true American, and as the son of Italian immigrants, I, Pete Domenici, will support redress.
In 1983, the Commission on Relocation and Internment of Civilians reported that the camps were not justified by military necessity and were the result of race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership.
In 1986, the Oregon Federal Court overturned Min Yasui's conviction. He died in November of 1986.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, and in 1990, President George H.W. Bush issued an official apology to Japanese Americans.
I received a letter on White House stationery signed by President George H.W. Bush. Enclosed was a check for $20,000. I took that check and went to grad school at age 64. The apology would have meant so much to my parents. Nikki Nojima Lewis, Nisei, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
In November 2015, Nisei received the posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was in good company. His fellow awardees were Yogi Berra and Shirley Chisholm. And what could be more American than that?
Meanwhile, back at the camps, Poston Camp was known as
Roasted!
Toastin'.
Dustin!
Now we're classified 4C.
Enemy alien.
All draft day Nisei males are required to answer questions 27 and 28 of a loyalty questionnaire.
These loyalty forms have aggravated tensions in camp.
Do you trust the government?
These could be trick questions, you know, to separate us from our families, or who knows what kinds of punishment they have in mind.
A lot are torn on both sides of the loyalty questionnaire.
Can you blame us? Our fathers were picked up immediately after Pearl Harbor, and now we're locked up behind barbed wire, and we're citizens.
And the federal government isn't satisfied with just putting us in the camps. Now they want us to fight for this country.
Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty or wherever ordered?
Hell no! I won't vow loyalty to the country that violates my civil rights. I refuse to enlist.
And I won't fight. Not while you're holding my parents behind barbed wire.
Question 28. Will you forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or to any other foreign government, power, or organization?
How do we know answering these questions won't jeopardize us?
Even if we're accepted as loyal, we might have to leave camp. But where will we go? The law forbids us to return to our homes. We've got no money, no hope of finding a job on the outside. We should stay in camp.
It's a trap. I say yes, it means allegiance to Japan.
My Nisei parents were denied citizenship all these years they've been in America, solely on the basis of race. For them, saying yes or no could make them stateless.
I'll refuse to answer. Or maybe I should answer no to both questions. As a matter of principle. No, I won't serve in the U.S. military as long as my family is behind barbed wire. And no, I won't forswear allegiance to the emperor. Wait a minute, that's not right. I never had any.
almost 75,000 people filled out the questionnaire. 6,700 answered no to questions 27 and 28. For their defiance, they were called no-nos.
Well, if you want to know, I said no, and I'm going to stick to no. If they want to segregate me, they can do it. If they want to take my citizenship, they can do it. If this country doesn't want me, they can throw me out. What do they know about loyalty? Morgan Yamanaka, internee, Manzanar.
But some said yes, in hopes of proving their loyalty to the U.S.
Others refused. They're known as no-no boys.
We got our name by answering no to 2 questions on a loyalty questionnaire.
No-no was an early act of civil disobedience.
I'm George Nakano, former California State Assemblyman. When my parents were asked whether they would swear allegiance to the United States and forswear any to Japan, they answered,
Undecided because of unjust, unconstitutional evacuation of citizens of Japanese ancestry.
Undecided because of existing racial discrimination and prejudice.
Frank Amy, an internee at Heart Mountain, Wyoming, organized the Fair Play Committee. They declared in March 1944,
"We, the members of the Fair Play Committee, are not afraid to go to war. We are not afraid to risk our lives for our country. We would gladly sacrifice our lives to protect and uphold the principles and ideals of our country as set forth in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, for on its inviolability depends the freedom, liberty, justice, and protection of all people, including Japanese Americans and all other minority groups." But have we been given such freedom, such liberty, such justice, such protection?
No!
all of the draft resistors were charged with
refusing to report for induction.
In Wyoming, 63 Heart Mountain resistors waived their right to jury trial, sir.
They were tried by a federal district judge in what remains the largest mass trial in Wyoming history.
The judge dismissed their constitutional objections to their incarceration and conscription, convicted them, and sentenced them to terms of 3 years.
In Idaho, the federal judge hearing the cases of the Minidoka resistors had earlier gone on record avowing distrust of all people of Japanese ancestry and support for mass incarceration.
These should be grounds for recusal.
The judge did not step aside. All who went to trial were convicted and prison terms set for 3 years and 3 months.
And in federal courts in Colorado, Utah, and Arkansas, judges imposed sentences ranging from 6 months to 3 years.
In Arizona, the trial judge convicted all of the resistors, but imposed a sentence of 1 penny as a fine.
In only one case was the pattern of convictions broken. In the summer of 1944, Judge Lewis E. Goodman of the United States District Court for the Northern District of California heard the prosecutions of the 27 young men who had resisted the draft at the Tule Lake Segregation Center. After a brief trial, he concluded that
it was shocking to the conscience to incarcerate an American citizen on suspicion of disloyalty, conscript him into the military, and then prosecute him for refusing. I dismiss the charges against these Tule Lake resistors as violations of their right to due process of law under the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
the government chose not to appeal the decision. The Tule Lake resistors were the only ones to beat the charges and avoid time in a federal penitentiary.
That is not to say that we avoided imprisonment.
Yeah, our reward for legal victory? Back to Tule Lake.
Virtually all of the Nisei draft resistors served their prison time at 3 federal prisons: Leavenworth in Kansas, McNeil Island in Washington, and the federal prison camp at Tucson, Arizona.
On December 23rd, President Harry S. Truman pardoned all of the Nisei draft resistors of World War II.
While their families were in the WRA camps, the majority of Issei men picked up by the FBI immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor were held in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Between 1942 and 1943, the Lordsburg internment camp imprisoned a total of 1,500 Issei men who had been considered security risks. Most of these men had resided in the United States for decades and fathered American-born children. Their average age was 55.
We were men from many regions of the United States, the territories of Hawaii and Alaska. I'm sure the endurance we showed in living through harsh conditions of this camp are because of the comfort and friendship we gave each other.
At 1:45 a.m. on July 27, 1943, a train from Bismarck, North Dakota arrived at Lordsburg with 147 new internees. They were met by armed American soldiers. The leader of the transport group told the sergeant who met him, quote, "We are handing over 147 internees, including 2 who are sick," unquote.
We got off the train and stood in 3 rows at the corner where the guards surrounded us. The sergeant told the 2 men who were sick to step out of the group. He told them to wait for a car that will pick them up.
2 men immediately stepped out from the road. One looked frail, the other had a pronounced limp. They were close friends.
The sergeant walked to the right side of the rows of men and ordered them to march.
We marched for 15 to 60 minutes and realized that no vehicle had come from the camp to get the sick men. We kept looking back toward the train tracks, noting the distance between the camp and our starting point.
They must have known about the sick men. Why hadn't they arranged to meet them before the train arrived? Are those 2 men still standing by the tracks in the prairie, waiting for someone to come and pick them up?
We finally reached the entrance of the camp at 3 a.m. Then a roll call was taken by a second lieutenant, and 145 of us internees, except the 2 sick men, were forced into the wire fence camp.
Soon after dawn, a story started that the 2 men who'd been separated from us had been shot to death by a soldier, that the men had tried to escape. We were stunned to hear the rumor because Mr. Kobata had been suffering from lung illness and had been in the hospital in Bismarck. He had to be transported to the train on a stretcher.
Mr. Isamura had a damaged spinal cord when he fell from a fishing boat more than 10 years before. He had difficulty walking. He had walked 5 or 6 feet, and then he'd have to stop. With physical handicaps, how could they have tried to escape? People came forward saying,
I heard 2 gunshots during roll call last night.
I heard 3 gunshots.
My dream was shattered by gunshots.
we vowed we'd find out the truth because we fellow Japanese, we help each other during the 6 months of the confinement in Bismarck.
34 of us rushed to the dispensary. We learned that Mr. Isamura died instantly at the scene, but Mr. Kobata had died in the infirmary at 5 a.m. Both were 57 and 58 years old.
The guard who had done the shooting, Private First Class Clarence Burleson, was acquitted after testifying that he was following military protocol.
In the summer of '43, the Nisei of Lordsburg were transferred to other camps, including Santa Fe. In 1944, Lordsburg imprisoned Italian and German POWs, which may have led to the assumption, still held today, that the Nisei men held there had been enemy Japanese captured in Japan.
All of us can't stay in the internment camps until the end of the war. Some of us have to go to the front. Our record on the battlefield will determine when you will return and how you'll be treated. I don't know if I'll make it back. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama, Company F, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He was killed in action October 20th, 1944.
The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, RCT, was organized on March 23, 1943, more than a year after Americans of Japanese descent were declared enemy aliens, 4C, by the U.S. War Department. Within a month, 2,686 volunteers from the 100th Battalion in Hawaii and 1,500 from the U.S. mainland were in Camp Shelby, Mississippi for basic training. All the commissioned officers were white.
Tension soon grew between the Buddha heads from Hawaii and the Kotanks from the mainland.
Katonk, you know, is the sound of a coconut when it falls out of a tree and hits the ground. It's also when the hollow heads of the mainland boys hit the ground after losing a fight with a Buddha head.
Those Buddha heads outnumbered us 2 to 1, and sometimes fought in gangs.
But a few visits to camps like Rohrer in Arkansas, and the Buddha had started gaining respect for the mainland guys. They were willing to fight in spite of having their rights trampled and their families incarcerated.
My main struggle was with the racism against blacks in the Deep South. We knew prejudice and discrimination at home, but man, the segregation we saw in Mississippi was something else.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Their outbursts and sometimes interventions on behalf of African Americans soon forced the officers to remind them that, quote, you can't end Jim Crow on your own, unquote.
On May 1st, 1944, we left for Italy, where we joined the 100th Infantry Battalion just north of Rome. We entered combat in June 1944.
Under the command of General Mark Clark, the RCT drove German forces north in the heavily defended mountainous terrain of northern Italy. After strenuous battles, the 442nd liberated the French towns of Bruyères, Belmont, and Bifontaine, whose inhabitants continue to honor the 442nd with monuments, museums, and streets named in their honor.
In late October 1944, we fought German troops in France adjacent to the border with Germany. Hitler had ordered his troops to defend this area of the mountains at all costs. It was thickly forested and bitter cold, with freezing rain and snow showers.
We'd been given a period of rest after heavy fighting, but we were called back.
In 5 days of battle, from 26 through 30 October 1944, the 442nd broke through German defenses and rescued 211 men.
We suffered over 800 casualties. Our commander sent patrol 50 to 55 men to attack the German roadblock to liberate the trapped men. Only 5 returned. 42 were taken prisoner.
We pushed on, and 9 days later captured the ridge that the Lost Battalion had been their objective.
In April 1945, General Mark Clark specifically asked for the 442nd to lead the way to break the Gothic line, the last obstacle to victory after nearly half a year of combat in northern Italy. In a dramatic nighttime march up the steep slopes of Mount Folgorito, the 442nd broke through the German defenses, which finally fell on May 2nd, 1945.
Meanwhile, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion of the 442nd were the first to arrive at subunits of the notorious Dachau extermination camp.
We shut off the lock of the gate. We were ordered to wait till other units joined us, but we couldn't stand the sight of the starving prisoners. We began dispensing clothing and medical supplies to our prisoners. To the prisoners, our officers looked the other way.
In Hawaii, the 100th 442nd were quickly acknowledged by the people. On the mainland, however, Nisei vets found an uneven reception.
When my uncle returned stateside, he walked into a barbershop in Haywood, California, and even though he was wearing his medals and his uniform and everything, he was refused service.
Statehood was finally achieved by the territory of Hawaii in 1959, in spite of considerable opposition in Congress. It's said that some of the credit went to the Texas congressional delegation, which acknowledged that the 442nd's rescue of the Texas Lost Battalion in France during World War II had influenced their decision.
The sons and grandsons of the still imprisoned families in American prison camps had earned the distinction of being, quote, the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in the history of the United States, unquote.
We were proud of our brothers, friends, and relatives fighting with the 442nd. Many families kept a personal shrine honoring them in our barrack apartments.
I've had family members who are pro-no-no and pro-military, and there's tension. We are anguished by the feelings that run on both sides. Those who felt their patriotism was questioned because they would not answer yes to the question, will you serve in the American military?
And can you believe it? Alongside a question asking if you'll give up allegiance to the Emperor of Japan.
Community divisions over differing responses to the incarceration continue to linger. Men who've known each other for 50 years will refuse to walk on the same side of the street when one has been a soldier and the other a no-no boy.
The tragedy is that for many, the lines that were drawn long ago have become so hardened that dialogue seems almost impossible. Chizu Omori, filmmaker.
When Lisa Kurata learned that her grandfather had been a no-no boy, she began to explore her Japanese-American heritage.
From my vantage point in history, the fact that people were forcibly incarcerated without due cause is crazy. And to think that people who shared this atrocity were pitted against one another because of questions 27 and 28 is even more crazy. Learning of my grandfather's decision to say no-no makes me proud, and I find this decision just as important as that of the men who felt called to fight in the war.
Shouldn't we remember that this country was founded on dissent, that there's an amendment about freedom of speech, and trying to right its wrongs might also mean you love your country?
Dream when you're feeling blue. Dream, that's the thing to do. Just watch the smoke ring rise in the air. You'll find that your share of memory there. So dream when the day is through. Dream and they might come true. Things never are as bad as they seem.
I would like the cast to introduce themselves and to maybe tell you a little bit about themselves and why they do this grueling, thankless work that in this day, you know, of speed is time-consuming and laborious, but very joyful. I mean, to face an audience, a live audience, is our work. So I want to start over here, and then we'll end with Mary, who will moderate our post-play discussion. So you'll get a chance to ask questions or make comments. And, you know, I see a couple of our original readers. We have a script committee, and I think this is pretty changed since a month ago when we started this. So I'll take it from Kelvin Kobayashi.
Hi, I'm Kelvin Kobayashi. Who are you with? Some of you heard my story before. A long time JACL, Japanese American Citizen League person. Sometime after college, I got involved with it and rediscovered my roots and discovered that I went through a good portion of my teenage years and looked at after that kind of being ashamed of being Japanese. And I've don't know why, but after 40-some years of trying to make up with that, this is what I'm still doing, and I will continue to do that. Right now, I'm presently a treasurer of the New Mexico JACL organization here, and I love doing this work because it's truly what inspires me and drives me every day.
My name is Rusty Chan, and I'm unfortunately not Japanese American. I'm Chinese American, and I'm the Vice President of the Asian American Association in New Mexico and the Vice President of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the Albuquerque chapter. In CACA, one of our great tenets is historical preservation, and that's why I choose to participate in projects such as this.
Hi, my name is Rod Ventura. I am a Filipino American. I am also with the Asian American Association of New Mexico, and I participate in these things because I am sort of drawn by the story of Japanese Americans and how it continues to be relevant today, particularly not just to Japanese Americans, but to all minority groups in the United States.
Thank you for coming. My name is Esther Churchwell, and I'm a sensei, third generation Okinawan from Hawaii, and I've been with the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League going on 36 years. And JCL is a civil rights organization, and I think that's why I participate in this, and just to be sure that history does not repeat itself.
Hi, I'm Stalin Candilasa, Hapa, Filipino-Japanese or Filipino-Okinawan from Hawaii, Sansei. I got volunteered here by my cousin Esther to be secretary of the JACL, so here I am.
Hi, I don't mean this because they have me wired already. My name is Mary Oishi, and I am Hapa as well, which means half. My mother was a Japanese citizen in Japan during World War II. My father was an American soldier for the United States, obviously, and they met during the occupation. And I, through a strange twist of circumstance, was raised by the KKK, who were relatives of my father's. So my life has been a journey of ridding myself of self-hatred for that and many other reasons, but also to work for human rights. And I work for human rights every way that I can, and this is one way that I can. You may know me as the development director of KUNM and as well the blues show host every other Wednesday night, but I've actually had a very long history of working for human rights. I was a delegate to the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, and that's just one of many, many things I've done. fight for human rights. And I do believe that this story is eminently timely at this point.
Thank you. J.W.
I'm J.W. Madison. I'm an electrician, an old house expert, a local actor, and a small-time activist in several great causes, to which I now add this great cause.
Okay, so Mary, you want to take over the...
Did you ever introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Nikki Nojima Lewis, and a couple of my stories were in the script. Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941 is my fourth birthday, and the FBI entered our home, took my dad away. He ended up in Lordsburg and Santa Fe, so my life has come full circle here. And I've been doing this for 30 years. I wrote my first oral history play, Breaking the Silence, in 1985 as a benefit of Gordon Hirabayashi, and I toured with him, so I had the privilege of knowing him, as well as Min Yasui's daughter. I didn't get to meet Min, but by working with his daughter and her play, Citizen Min in New Mexico, I learned about Min's activism here. So there are many undiscovered stories. The reason I'm here and I remain here is because there's very little known about the prison camps. Most people for almost over 50 years, the War Relocation Authority camps, I call them the family camps, that I was in Minidoka, are fairly well known to people on the West Coast. But, I talk to people all the time who grew up in New Mexico, and there's very little knowledge about the prison camps, the Department of Justice prison camps in Lordsburg and Santa Fe. That will be our next project, and that gives me a chance to, plug the book, Clo, Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, that is on display there. A couple of the major workers of that project are here, including one of the authors of that book. So I encourage you to take a look at that. That will be our next project. We will adapt stories from that book to this Reader's Theater format. And I also want to point out Cynthia Grady's wonderful book that just came out. So I hope you'll visit the education table. Now on to Mary. I have one. I have one. So she has a mic. This is Paul Mayer, who has one of the thankless tasks of helping us behind the scenes. So he's going to be the runner with a mic.